He was pouring himself another glass of red wine when I caught myself watching his hands. Large, slow, deliberate movements. He didn't fumble, didn't hesitate, didn't fill the silence with awkward comments. Just refilled the glass, set the bottle down with a quiet thud, and looked at me. Not in a way that lingered, not inappropriate, but with a kind of knowing, quiet presence that unsettled me far more than it should have. My husband had excused himself to take a work call upstairs. He always took his work calls upstairs, even at family dinners. It was easier that way. Less noise, better reception, and no one would overhear the way he flipped from husband to project manager without pause. His father stayed behind, offered to help with the dishes. I told him no at first, out of habit, but he insisted, gently, and I gave in. Because, truthfully, I didn't want to be alone. It was silent between us for a while. The plates were warm, slick with soapy water. I passed them to him to dry, and he folded the towel with slow precision, like someone who knew how to do things properly without asking twice. "You always move this quietly?" he asked suddenly, voice low and calm. Not teasing, not flirty, just a question. A curious, pointed question that struck deeper than it should have. I hesitated. "Maybe," I said. "Maybe I just learned not to take up too much space." He didn't smile or nod. He just dried another plate, held it up to the light to check for streaks, and placed it carefully on the rack. There was nothing romantic in that moment, nothing scandalous, just air. But that air felt thick, charged, like a room just before the lights flicker out. And I hated that I noticed it. My marriage, on paper, was fine. No major arguments, no betrayals, no hidden accounts or sudden absences. We had routines, weekend brunches, matching towels, shared calendars. But inside those clean lines, something in me had stopped breathing. I couldn't remember the last time my skin reacted to my husband's touch. Not because he was cruel or careless. Just distant. Polished. Predictable. As if he made love like a checklist. Eye contact, check. Warm up, check. 5 minutes of effort, then collapse. I never said anything. I kept folding laundry and buying groceries and accepting his compliments like folded napkins. "You look beautiful. You're amazing. I'm lucky." Always the same words. Always delivered like lines he'd practiced in the mirror. But his father, he didn't speak like that. He didn't fill spaces with affirmation. He just occupied them, fully, presently. And that presence, as absurd as it sounded, stirred something in me I hadn't felt in years. After dinner, the others left the table one by one. Some went to smoke, others retreated to the guest room. And I stayed behind to gather the cups. He stayed too, though he didn't need to. I bent to pick up a fork that had slipped to the floor, and when I stood up, I felt him close, just enough that I caught his scent. Not cologne. Something warmer.
Skin, maybe. Wool. Soap.
It unsettled me how quickly I recognized it again. The next day, he said quietly, he was just like this when he was younger. Never stopped moving. It was meant about his son, my husband. A small comment, tossed gently, but I latched onto it. Something about the way he said it made me feel studied, seen, and I hated how much I liked that. I tried to brush it off, change the subject. "He always says he got it from you," I said. He laughed softly. Not a full chuckle, more of a hum. I doubt that. It wasn't even flirting. That's what I kept telling myself. There was nothing in what he said or did that crossed any line. But I felt the shift. I felt it in my shoulders, in the way I stood, in the sharp awareness of my own body, how the thin fabric of my blouse stuck to my spine, how I hadn't changed out of my tight skirt after dinner. He didn't comment on it, didn't let his eyes wander. He just moved around me with care, with silence, with unbearable calm. When the dishes were done, he thanked me, and said he'd turn in for the night. I stayed in the kitchen long after he left, running my fingers along the edge of the marble counter. The house was quiet now. Upstairs, the door to my bedroom was closed. The room where my husband lay, likely already asleep, with his phone buzzing beside him. Probably with a muted Slack notification. I didn't want to go up.
Not yet.
Instead, I made myself a cup of tea I wouldn't drink, stood barefoot on the cold tile, and let myself remember how close he had stood. How deliberate his hands were. How still everything had been. It was nothing, I told myself, this more than once that night. But it stayed with me in the way real things do. Quietly.
Steadily.
As if returning from far away, just to remind you they exist. And when I finally climbed into bed next to my husband, I lay on my side, eyes open to the dark, and wondered not what had happened, but what might. That was the part that kept me awake. The wondering. The way my body responded to something it had no business responding to. He hadn't touched me, but something had shifted, and I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. The morning didn't wash away the tension. If anything, it etched it deeper beneath my skin. He was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, wearing a faded t-shirt and soft, worn-in sweatpants that made no attempt to disguise age or time. But the way he stood there, calm, grounded, present, it did something to the room.
To me.
He didn't need to speak to fill a space. He just existed in it. And somehow, that was louder than words. My husband walked out of the bathroom with a towel over his shoulder, kissed the top of my head absent-mindedly, and muttered, "I need to leave earlier than planned." Then he disappeared upstairs to finish getting ready, as if this morning were like any other. As if my body hadn't spent half the night remembering a silence that said far more than anything he'd ever said to me in bed. I made coffee. I didn't want it, but it gave me something to do. Something to hold while my hands tried to ignore their own trembling. His father sat near the window, the sun casting a line of gold along the bridge of his nose. He didn't say anything, just placed his mug gently on the table next to mine, like it belonged there, like I did too. When the front door finally clicked shut behind my husband, the house changed its shape. The walls didn't move. Nothing dramatic shifted, but everything felt quieter, fuller, charged, in the way of a room just before a thunderstorm breaks. I busied myself with chores, vacuuming, sorting laundry, folding towels that didn't need folding. It was all muscle memory, motion without meaning. He stayed outside, in the garage, repairing something that didn't matter. And every now and then, I'd hear a soft clatter, the sound of metal against wood, and feel it resonate low in my belly, like an echo. When he came back in, he didn't say much, just nodded. There was no tension, no awkwardness, only the space between us, tight and tender like skin over bone. I found it unbearable how normal we were pretending to be. I went upstairs for a shower, hoping the water would rinse away the strange heat under my skin. But it didn't. It only made me more aware. Every touch of my fingers against my body, every pass of the washcloth across my chest and thighs, stirred something deeper, something dormant. I leaned my head against the tile and inhaled slowly, trying to calm a pulse that no longer obeyed me. When I stepped out, wrapped in a towel, my hair still wet and sticking to my collarbones, I felt oddly exposed. Not because I was undressed, but because my skin had memory now, and it was still buzzing. And then I saw him. I didn't expect him to be there, in the hallway, tool in hand, mid-step. We both froze. My towel slipped, just slightly, revealing more of my leg than I'd meant to. I should have adjusted it. I didn't. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, he didn't look away. There was no smirk, no arrogance, just stillness, awareness, and something else, restraint, maybe, or hunger cloaked in decency. "You're trembling," he said softly. I don't even know if he realized he said it out loud. "Maybe because you're standing too close," I replied, though my voice betrayed me. It didn't sound annoyed. It sounded like an invitation. He didn't move toward me, but he didn't step back either. The kiss wasn't premeditated. It wasn't impulsive either. It felt inevitable, like reaching for a cup that's always been there, waiting. His lips were warm,
Dry.
gentle in a way that made my skin burn. There was no urgency, no dominance. He kissed me like a man who, he knew how easily something real could vanish, slowly, with reverence. My breath caught in my chest, and for a brief second, I let myself fall into that space where there were no husbands or titles or rules, just sensation. When he pulled back, I stepped away. Not because I wanted to leave, but because I didn't trust what I'd do if I stayed. Neither of us spoke. I climbed the stairs slowly, the towel damp against the back of my knees, my body still humming with confusion and heat. Inside the bathroom, I leaned against the door, eyes closed, heart pounding in a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. He hadn't touched me inappropriately. He hadn't said anything wrong, but something in me had changed. Something had opened, something that wanted, something that knew. And more than anything, I realized I would want it again. The third morning came with an unexpected stillness. Not the pleasant kind that follows a good night's rest, but the kind that wraps around your body like a sheet left in the freezer, cold, thin, and impossible to ignore. I stood at the kitchen counter slicing strawberries for no one in particular, the blade making soft, damp sounds against the wooden board. My husband sat nearby, barely awake, sipping coffee as if it were medicine, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the window. I watched him for a moment longer than I should have. There was nothing inherently wrong with him. He was clean, punctual, polite. But he was fading into the wallpaper of my life. Present, yes, but colorless, like a habit I never questioned. He looked up briefly and asked if I wanted to come with him on a short trip out of town. A weekend getaway. Some vague mention of a cabin. Time alone. Disconnecting. It should have made me feel something, gratitude, maybe hope. But instead, I felt the familiar twinge of resistance in my chest, as if my body already knew the answer before my mouth had time to lie. "I think I'll stay," I said, after a pause too long to pass unnoticed. "There's so much to catch up on here. I haven't even organized the boxes in the storage room." He didn't press. He rarely did. By noon, his suitcase was packed. He kissed my cheek without really looking, and I forced myself not to flinch. There was no anger in me, no bitterness, just the acute awareness that even his touch had become obligatory, predictable. The way people hug relatives at funerals, out of habit, out of duty. After he left, the air in the house shifted once again. It was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of shift you feel in your spine before a storm. I walked slowly through the rooms, unsure of what I was looking for. Maybe space, maybe silence, or maybe just a reason not to feel what I was feeling. He appeared around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I didn't expect him to knock before coming into the house. This was his son's home, after all, but the knock came anyway. 3 soft, deliberate taps, as if he were asking not for entry, but for permission to be seen again. I opened the door without a word. He stood there in a navy jacket, the collar slightly turned up, hair windswept, holding a paper bag that smelled faintly of apples and cinnamon. "I brought something," he said, offering the bag without ceremony. I took it. The warmth seeped through the paper and into my palms, a ridiculous detail, but my body remembered the warmth longer than it remembered the taste of anything inside. He didn't stay in the kitchen. He walked into the living room as if he'd done it 100 times, sat in the armchair by the window, and rested his hands on his knees. I followed a few minutes later, the bag unopened in my hands. We didn't talk for a while, just existed in the same space, the kind of silence that no longer felt empty, but layered, complex, saturated. It was he who finally broke it, his voice softer than I expected. "Did you mean to stay behind?" I didn't pretend not to understand. "Yes," I said. There was no judgment in his face, no assumption, just a subtle shift in his posture, as if he'd been holding something heavy in his chest and had just now set it down. "You didn't have to," he said, almost more to himself than to me. I watched the way his fingers folded and unfolded in his lap. Strong, capable hands. The kind of hands that did things deliberately, unlike my husband's, which had grown used to swiping screens and tapping keys. There was something grounding about the way this man sat, as if gravity respected him more than others. I thought of the kiss again. Not its taste or even the act, but the way my body had leaned into it before my mind even agreed. It scared me, how little resistance I had, how much I'd wanted it. He stood up at some point and walked to the window. I followed his movement, watched how the light hit the curve of his neck. There was nothing overtly seductive in his stance, nothing aggressive. But everything about his presence made my body lean forward without permission. We talked a little eventually about meaningless things, weather, furniture, the noisy neighbors. But even in those words, something hung underneath. A hum, a current, the unsaid getting louder with every sentence. As the late afternoon folded into early evening, he stood and said he should get going. I walked him to the door, the bag of untouched pastries still sitting on the counter like a forgotten gift. We paused in the doorway, not touching, not speaking. And then he said, "You don't have to explain anything." It wasn't a statement meant to comfort me. It was a mirror, reflecting everything I had tried not to think. I nodded, lips pressed together, throat dry. When he left, I didn't move for a long time. I stood by the door, staring at the quiet street, my hand resting on the frame as if it could hold me steady. Upstairs, the bed was freshly made. The sheets smelled like lavender and detergent. I sat on the edge of it, my fingers trailing along the seam of the pillowcase. My body wasn't quiet. It was loud, restless. It remembered everything. The warmth of his breath, the closeness of his voice, the restraint in his hands. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I just sat there, still in my blouse and jeans, and realized something that terrified me. I wasn't waiting for guilt. I was waiting for him to come back. Throw it away. That was it. For a full minute, I didn't open it. I held it in my hands, letting the weight of it settle into my body, and something sharp and breathless stirred at the base of my spine. I wasn't even sure why it scared me. When I finally lifted the lid, I found a set of lingerie inside. Nothing garish, nothing cheap, just one piece, soft, ivory, seamless, delicate. The kind of fabric that didn't demand attention but rewarded it. It was absurdly simple. No lace, no bows. Just elegance. And it was mine, in the exact size I wore. He hadn't asked, hadn't guessed. He had known. I carried it upstairs like contraband, my heart pounding louder than the sound of my own steps. The bedroom was filled with afternoon light when I closed the door behind me, the floor warm beneath my feet, and the mirror standing tall against the opposite wall like a silent witness. I didn't try it on right away. I stood there, staring at it folded across my hands, wondering what it meant that I wanted it so badly. Not the gift itself, but the feeling it gave me. A feeling I hadn't felt in years. That I was seen, desired, not as a wife, not as someone's daughter-in-law, but as a woman. One with a body. One with nerve endings and longing and skin that remembered what it was like to be hungry for something she couldn't name. I peeled off my clothes slowly, not out of seduction but reverence. My fingers brushed my hip bones, my ribs. I looked at my body as if I were seeing it for the first time. The slight marks of age, the softness in places once taught, the faint shadows along my collarbone. And somehow, in that moment, none of it felt like failure. It felt like truth. I put the piece on carefully. It hugged me in ways nothing else ever had. Not too tight, not revealing. Just there, like a second skin that whispered instead of screamed. And then I looked at myself in the mirror. It was not about beauty. It wasn't even about sex. It was about presence, ownership, about seeing myself and knowing that I still had the power to want, that I wasn't invisible, that I hadn't faded completely into the life I'd built. I stood like that for what must have been 10-15 minutes. The sunlight shifted behind me, making slow